She came in, just smiled at me and said, "Don't worry." And she tied the wire around my wrists, made me lie on the floor, tied around the bottom of the toilet.
I was pregnant off of my father, and I was so ill I had to have some of my insides removed.
The following video contains graphic and disturbing content which may be upsetting for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. Frederick Walter Stephen West was born in September 1941 in the United Kingdom, in a quaint village in the West Midlands. Much Marcle is a rural farming community approximately 20 miles from the nearest city of Gloucester. It consists of a school, 2 churches, a village hall, 2 pubs, and an automobile repair garage. Surrounding this village are farms that are primarily utilized for cider production. Fred West was the first surviving child of Walter and Daisy West. Their first child survived only 1 day after being prematurely born. Daisy was Walter's second wife. After only 2 years of marriage, she died, supposedly due to a bee sting, and Walter married Daisy a mere 2.5 months later. They went on to have a large family of 6 children, and Fred had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. All of the children helped out on the farm, as was customary at the time. Another thing that was customary in the West family was abuse and incest. Fred suffered abuse from his own mother when he was only 12 years old, while his father misused his sisters at an even younger age. Physical punishment was the result of any misbehavior. Despite his mother's authoritarian nature, Fred was a mama's boy. He idolized his father and, more comfortable on the farm than in school, he found common ground with him amid their shared tasks. It was during these interactions that Walter filled his son's mind with twisted views on sexual matters, shaping Fred into the disturbing individual he would later become. Walter West held a malicious belief that it was a father's responsibility to initiate his daughters for marriage, and that their first child should be fathered by him. His interest in the farm's sheep was another disturbing influence on Fred. The constant exposure to such perverse discussions fueled Fred's later obsessions. When Fred turned 15, his father began paying him a small wage for his contributions on the farm. At 16, he saved up to buy a motorbike, which was a useful tool for his interests in the opposite sex. He took to buying and sometimes stealing jewelry to provide as engagement rings to numerous girls, an empty promise only to get them into bed. Fred maintained multiple affairs simultaneously, caring little about the relationship status of these girls. Following a severe motorbike accident that resulted in a head injury, Fred's personality took a dark and moody turn. Once he recovered, he didn't return to farm work, but instead found employment at a shipyard in Gloucester, relishing the thrill of naval life, including the stereotypical girl in every port. He'd come back home during the off-seasons. During one such leave, his 13-year-old sister found herself pregnant. Initially, she accused Fred of being the father, but when questioned by authorities, she chose to remain silent. Neither confirming nor denying this, she effectively saved Fred from the charge of incest. Fred just continued exploiting girls, ones who were usually much younger than himself. He led a nomadic life, alternating between the city of Gloucester and rural Much Marcle. Along the way, he met Catherine, who everyone called Rena. She had a troubled past involving theft, prostitution, and legal issues. Fred was unfazed by her lifestyle and even enjoyed sharing her with other men. When she became pregnant by one of her customers, he claimed the child as his own and proposed to her. His mother strongly disapproved of Rena, but Fred ignored her objections. They got married and moved to Scotland. When the baby came, it looked nothing like Fred because the father was Pakistani. So they told Fred's parents that Rena had lost the baby and that they had adopted a girl they called Charmaine. Despite claiming paternity, Fred showed no interest in the baby, and even slept with Rena's sister while Rena was in the hospital giving birth. Their relationship was unstable and abusive, with Fred often forcing sex and hitting her. Yet they remained together, accepting each other's flaws and troubles without judgment. Soon, Rena became pregnant again, but not wanting to have the child, she tried to terminate it herself. She was unsuccessful, much to Fred's relief. He wanted a child of his own, not one that was fathered by someone else. He made no secret of this to Charmaine. He consistently exhibited violent tendencies towards her and favored his biological daughter, Anna Marie. Fred was working as an ice cream man, and during his absence, Rena began an affair with a married man named John. One fateful day, Fred accidentally ran over a 3-year-old child with his ice cream van. Fred was cleared by police, but the death of the child didn't exactly endear him to the locals. So he skipped town, intending to go back to Muchmarkel. Returning home was not the relief Fred hoped for. Rena's mixed-race daughter was not welcome. Daisy West refused to accommodate her son and his family. With no other apparent options, Fred's daughters were placed into state care. Fred then rented a mobile home in a caravan park near Gloucester, and eventually Rena came to join him, along with 2 of her female friends, Anne and Issa. They were able to get the children back from care, and Anne and Issa assisted with the child care. Fred also expected all 3 women to fulfill his desires, and if they did not, he beat them viciously. Rena called upon her former boyfriend John to come and rescue her, but by that time Anne had begun to fall for Fred. Anne informed Fred of Rena's plan to run away with Issa and her daughters. He showed up when the planned meeting was taking place and said Anne would be staying with him to care for Rena's daughters and that he'd kill them if he ever saw them again. Rena was forced to flee back to Scotland without her kids. Fred remained at the caravan with Anne and the 2 girls and began working at a slaughterhouse. This would be a dark omen of things to come. Attempting to put aside the issues for the sake of the children, Rena would return to stay with Anne, Fred, and the kids periodically. But she grew to resent Anne's presence and motherly role in her children's life. It only became worse when Anne got pregnant with Fred's child. When Anne was 8 months along, Fred and Rena began to make plans to move to another caravan park, but Anne didn't go with them. After the move, things with Rena seemed better at first, but Fred was always preying on young women, telling Rena the girls would be nannies for the children. That and the abuse she endured became too much, and she would leave Fred for long periods before returning again. Sometimes the children would go into state care if there wasn't a woman in the household to care for them while Fred worked. He was now digging trenches for the highway department on the side of the M5 motorway. His bosses said that Fred was a very hard worker. In fact, he was the best digger on the crew. However, building was Fred's favorite occupation, whether he worked for a company or as a freelancer. He had a work van, but Fred liked to flirt with girls on the bus. Perhaps he enjoyed the thrill of a captive audience. If he took his kids along, he'd be just an ordinary father, running errands with the kids, putting women at ease. He was doing some work at what is now the Clean Plate Cafe in Gloucester, and would also familiarize himself with the young waitresses there. One waitress, Mary Bathsholm, was 15 and worked at the cafe. She was waiting for a bus one evening, on the way to visit her boyfriend, but she never arrived. Fred's mother passed away unexpectedly shortly after, so he was not able to assist in the search for the missing waitress. Born on November 29, 1953, Rosemary Letts had a troubled childhood. Her mother, also named Daisy, became depressed while pregnant with Rosemary. She received electroconvulsive therapy during her pregnancy. Her father, Bill, afflicted with untreated schizophrenia, was a source of suffering for her and her siblings. His abusive nature extended to Rosemary, a situation worsened by her parents' perception of her as slow. The abusive environment led to her adapting a survival mechanism, using sex as a means to avoid punishment. When Rosemary was 15, her mother took her and her 2 brothers away from their father, making their way to Cheltenham. Rosemary found employment at a canteen, but trouble continued to follow her. She started involving herself with older men and even sharing living arrangements with them. In a deeply concerning escalation of behavior, she started to molest her little brothers. One day, when Rosemary returned home after a stay with an older boyfriend, she found the house empty. Her mother and brothers were gone. With nowhere else to go, Rosemary returned to her abusive father. Rose met Fred at a busy bus station while she was on her way to work. Fred showered her with attention and compliments, as he had done with countless other young women. He asked her out on dates, and eventually she relented. When her father found out about her relationship with Fred, he would have none of it. He locked her in the house, forbidding her to see Fred. Rose, however, remained defiant and started sneaking out to maintain her relationship with him. Her father involved social services, and Rose was placed in a home for troubled teen girls. Meanwhile, Fred's involvement in petty crimes led to his arrest due to unpaid fines. When he was released after serving 30 days, a now pregnant 16-year-old Rose left the girls' home to go live with Fred. Rena is thankful that Fred is preoccupied with his newest babysitter/girlfriend, thinking it might keep her out of trouble. Fred and Rose move from the caravan to a flat at 25 Midland Road, and Rose gives birth to her first daughter, Heather Ann. Rose's new life gets disrupted because of Fred's criminal activities, and he is sentenced to 6 months in jail. Rena also ends up getting arrested for soliciting prostitution. Rose is left alone to care for the kids without Fred. During Fred's absence, Rose turned to prostitution to make ends meet. She also subjected Charmaine and Anna Marie to constant abuse, using a wooden spoon as her weapon of choice. She had a particular dislike for Charmaine, who would defiantly say things like, "You're not my real mommy," and refuse to cry during the beatings. Rose would force the children to stand naked while she verbally abused and physically assaulted them with the spoon. Allegedly, she even bound and gagged Charmaine while she used the spoon to beat her. In letters between Fred and Rose while he was in prison, there were discussions about Charmaine leaving the home with Rena. She wasn't his child and never was. He wrote,
"Let me know about Char, yes or no. I say yes, but it's up to you, my darling, and then we can have our son. I love you and Anna and Heather forever, my darling."
Fred was released in the summer of 1971, and soon the children would return to school. Rose and Fred told the school that Charmaine had moved to London and would not be coming back. They told Anna Marie that Charmaine had gone off with her mother. Charmaine often confided in her half-sister, saying, "Mommy will come and rescue me one day." Anna Marie must have felt confused and abandoned, wondering why she never saw her sister or Mommy again. Fred and Rose were soon expecting again, so they decided to marry. Even while pregnant, Rose continued to entertain clients, and Fred continued going out at night, looking for girls waiting for the bus or looking like they needed a ride. Sometimes Rose would accompany him on his drives. They would tell their neighbor that they drove around at night looking for runaways, and having Rose there would put the girls at ease. Their neighbor took it as a joke, but it was far from it. Fred had begun doing building work for the landlord at 25 Midland Road. The landlord persuaded Fred to purchase a fixer-upper from him. He loaned Fred the money for the deposit and helped him apply for a mortgage. Fred was thrilled to begin renovating his new home at number 25 Cromwell Street. This address would end up being almost as well known as the home of the Prime Minister, number 10 Downing Street. Fred built some special purpose rooms in his new home. Some of the spaces he made into bedsits, single rooms for renters, which he typically leased to people on benefits. This guaranteed him some passive income. Rose had her own room where she would meet her clients, so Fred set up a video camera in there. The home had a large basement. Fred would tell people that it would make a great playroom for the kids, but the basement of 25 Cromwell wouldn't be the playroom you might imagine. Fred and Rose were very relaxed landlords. They didn't care if the tenants smoked pot or had their friends over late at night. Fred and Rose would sometimes join them, taking the opportunity to befriend both the tenants and their guests. Rose enjoyed the company of both men and women, and Fred encouraged her in both cases. Their preferred type were very young girls who were easy to manipulate. Rose would play a motherly figure and get the girls to open up about their pasts. Those who came from broken homes or were abuse survivors were more susceptible to their grooming. Their hook would sometimes be to come and work as their nanny. Rose would end up giving birth to 8 children in total, so there were always kids to care for. Before long, the talk would always turn sexual in nature. Fred would tell these girls that he knew how to terminate a pregnancy in case they ever got in trouble. Sometimes the girls would get uncomfortable and leave, like 16-year-old Carol Rain. She got sick of Fred walking in on her when she was in the bath, so she went back home to her parents. One night, she left her house, looking to hitch a ride into town. Fred and Rose were out driving that night, and they stopped and convinced her to accept a ride. Rose got into the back seat with Carol, and as they drove, Rose started to tell Carol how much the children missed her. Rose began groping Carol, and when Carol resisted, Fred knocked her out with a punch to the head. When Carol came to, her arms were tied up with her own scarf, and brown sticky tape was being wound around her entire head, covering her mouth. She was brought into the cellar, and her clothing was removed. Fred and Rose beat and assaulted her. They threatened to leave her in the basement, telling her they would allow men to come and go as they wished, and then they would bury her in there. Eventually, they released her, but she wasn't free to leave. She would be their nanny. She had no choice but to agree, and she told them she needed her things from home, so they agreed to take her there. Carol planned to escape on this trip, but she took an earlier opportunity to run when Rose had her go and get the laundry washed. She ran away, stayed with a friend, and returned to her mother the following day. She told her mother what had happened, and they called the police. During the interview, the police discovered that Carol had a relationship with one of the tenants at 25 Cromwell, tainting their view of Carol as an innocent victim. Fred and Rose were arrested, but Carol still felt embarrassed and ashamed. When her lawyer prepared her for testifying, Carol was scared at the prospect of having to relive everything, so she dropped the most serious charges, and Fred and Rose were convicted of a lesser assault charge. Their lawyer appealed to the judge that the Wests had a family to care for, and Rose was pregnant again. Fred and Rose West walked away with no prison time, and Carol remained silent about her ordeal for decades. Fred now throws himself into working on the house. He begins inventing contraptions for the basement, and 8-year-old Anna Marie becomes the test subject. She would endure horrible abuse, all in the name of preparing her for a future husband, as all fathers do. Rose would join in, using objects and beating Anna Marie. Sadly, this would become a routine for Anna Marie, one that she kept secret for many years. Fred and Rose continued to prey upon girls and young women. They continued to pick up runaways on their late-night drives and groom the tenants or their friends. People came and went so often, who knows where they went after leaving 25 Cromwell Street. Sometimes people looked for their loved ones, sometimes they didn't. Fred and Rose's father, Bill, decided to go into business together, and they opened a cafe. Fred got to know the young waitresses there when he worked on construction or checked in on the business. Rose was expecting again, but this time it was a client who fathered the child. Fred wasn't thrilled at the prospect and turned to a young waitress named Shirley Robinson. Shirley told him she was gay, and he introduced her to Rose, who quickly took advantage of her. Eventually, Rose got Fred involved in the affair, and soon Shirley was pregnant with Fred's child. Rose was now losing interest in Shirley, and Fred successfully pitted the pregnant women against one another. One day Shirley, nearly at full term, disappears. When asked, Fred would say she moved to have her baby in Germany. Anna Marie is now a teenager, and Fred aims to keep his twisted family tradition alive. Anna Marie became pregnant, but had to undergo a termination as the pregnancy was ectopic. This is not a viable pregnancy and is a life-threatening condition for the mother. Anna Marie ran away soon after, and Fred's attention turned towards her younger sisters, Heather and May.
And Rosemary sat on my face, on top of me. And I remember feeling this awful pain inside me.
Rose would set her sights on brother Stephen, but the three siblings banded together in an attempt to prevent the abuse using different tactics. This was a very traumatic experience for all of the children, but it affected Heather more than anyone else. She was a good student, but would often get in trouble for refusing to shower or change clothing for physical education. If she was asked, she would make excuses for the marks on her body. After leaving school, Heather hoped she could escape the torture by getting a live-in summer job, but her application was rejected. She was devastated. The following day, when her siblings came home from school, her parents informed them that Heather had accepted the job and left earlier that day. However, her brothers and sisters always wondered why Heather never called or wrote them. It was explained away each time, always with a reason that the authorities shouldn't be involved. One story was that Heather was involved with credit card fraud. Another was that she was running drugs for a cartel. It became a family joke that if any child misbehaved or involved any outsiders in the family's business, that they would end up buried under the patio with Heather. By the early 90s, Fred had moved on to a new hobby, making and selling pornography. He and Rose would film all sorts of their own encounters, as well as duplicating commercial videotapes. He amassed a personal collection that included torture and bestiality, and possibly even worse than that. But when 13-year-old Louise West told a schoolmate what her father had done to her, the house that Fred built started to crumble.
As the girl reported missing earlier in the day.
A warrant was obtained to search the home in an attempt to find this videotaped evidence, but police did not locate anything of that nature in Fred's collection. All the underage children were placed into care, and Fred and Rose were arrested on grounds of abuse. Rose was released on bail, and Fred remained in custody for nearly a year while awaiting trial. In June of 1993, the case against Fred and Rose evaporated when Louise recanted her statements and the older sisters declined to testify. They were scared that Rose might retaliate against the younger children and make things worse for them. But Anna Marie had previously told investigators about how she hadn't seen her mother or half-sister for many years. She also told them about the family joke, but the police didn't think it was funny. On February 24, 1994, police obtained a warrant to search the grounds of 25 Cromwell Street for the remains of Heather West. The following day, Fred and Rose West are arrested on suspicion of murdering their daughter. Fred initially confessed to killing Heather, saying that Rose had no knowledge of it. So Rose got released on bail. Fred told the police where to dig for Heather's remains, but he didn't expect them to dig up the entire back garden. Heather wasn't the only one found buried at 25 Cromwell Street. Only a few days after issuing the warrant, multiple sets of human remains would be found. Over the following weeks, police made use of the new technology in forensics called ground-penetrating radar. They located some anomalies under the home, and additional bodies were discovered in the cellar. Fred would maintain that Rose had nothing to do with the murders. She didn't know a thing. He thought by taking the blame he would save her from prosecution. Throughout Fred's many interviews, he had a lot of varied reasons for how these women came to be under the ground. He would say they were sex games gone wrong to explain away the ropes, gags, and other items discovered with the remains. He only decapitated and dismembered the women to make it easier to bury them. But when asked about the missing bones, he refused to comment. Possibly the most horrific finds were those of the woman found with her intrauterine device missing, and another woman with an unborn child. The medical examiner would say that he thought the baby's skeleton wasn't in the right position. Obviously, these women weren't skeletons when they were initially buried. It took almost 2 months before the search of 25 Cromwell ended, but excavations were just beginning at Letterbox and Finger Post Fields at Kempley, a village adjacent to Muchmarkel. The police would be digging there for almost 2 more months before finding Catherine Rena West in Letterbox Field and Anne McFall and her unborn child in Finger Post Field. Also of interest was Fred and Rose's previous address, 25 Midland Road. Charmaine West was found under the kitchen floor there. The remains discovered at 25 Cromwell Street were those of Heather West, Shirley Ann Robinson, Allison Chambers, Therese Siegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, Lucy Partington, Juanita Mott, Linda Gauff, and Carol Ann Cooper. June 30th, 1994. Before the court read out the charges against them, Fred reached out to touch his wife's shoulder with his hand. He had not seen Rose since he was arrested in February. But Rose did not look at him or acknowledge him. She shrank away from his touch as if it hurt her. In denying any knowledge of the crimes, she had to play the part, publicly rejecting him. His desire to shield her had an unintended consequence, and he became depressed over the next few months. He retaliated in anger, recanting his confessions and implicating her in all the murders, even the ones she wasn't charged with. He was charged with all 12 murders, and she was charged with 9. On New Year's Day in 1995, Fred was found hanged in his cell.
Frederick West, charged with 12 murders, has been found dead in his prison cell.
Fred's last letter to his wife said,
I haven't got you a present, but all I have is my life. I will give it to you, my darling. When you're ready, come to me. I will be waiting for you.
After his death, Rose received another murder charge. While the notes he left behind professed his love for Rose, he had left her alone to face 10 murder charges. The jury returned 10 guilty verdicts, and she was given a life sentence.
Rosemary West has been convicted of 10 of the most horrific murders in British criminal history. You will never be released, the judge said, if attention is paid to what I think.
In the UK, even a life sentence has the possibility of parole, but in 1997, her conviction was converted into a whole life order with no possibility for parole. There have been only 3 women that have been given a whole life order in the UK. Myra Hindley is a serial killer who abused and murdered at least 5 children with her husband Ian in the mid-1960s. The other is serial killer Joanna Dennehy. If you'd like to learn more about that case, that chapter did a video about it. You should definitely give it a go. I'll leave a link in the description. Rose still maintains her innocence and attempted to appeal on 2 occasions, but has not tried again since 2001. She stated that even if she were to be released, her life would never be normal, and at least in prison she can sometimes see her children. Her stay in prison hasn't been without controversy. She was supposedly in a romantic relationship with Myra Hindley before Myra died in 2002. In 2003, it was announced that Rose was to marry Dave Glover, who was in a band called Slade that was popular in the UK in the 60s and 70s. Their biggest hit was Merry Christmas Everyone, a Christmas #1 on the UK charts in 1973. The band originally wrote and released Come On Feel the Noise in the same year. This song was covered by Quiet Riot in 1983 and was number 5 on the US Billboard charts. The wedding was called off right after it was announced due to the negative publicity that Dave was getting. The band kicked Dave out as a result. Serial killer Joanna Dennehy was sent to the same prison as Rose, and when she arrived there, Joanna reportedly threatened to kill her. This forced authorities to move Rose to another prison. There may be more people who fell victim to Fred and Rose West than just the ones that were found. In 2021, a documentary crew was filming at a cafe that was the former workplace of Mary Bastholm. Fred has long been suspected to have been involved in her disappearance. The film crew notified police that they had located what they believed to be evidence of human remains. The police spent 2 weeks excavating, but no remains were located. The case of Mary Bastholm remains unsolved. The house at 25 Cromwell was demolished, and in its place is a pathway leading to the town center. The families of Rose and Fred West have suffered lasting trauma from their actions. Stephen West was convicted of abusing a 14-year-old girl. The Wests had 2 boys named Stephen, and this was their biological son, spelled with a PH, not to be confused with Stephen with a V, Fred's son with a different woman. Barry West died of a drug overdose at age 40. Fred's brother John took his own life while on trial for abusing 2 minors. Stephen Letts, Rose's nephew, was convicted for the kidnap and assault of a 12-year-old girl. He gave her drugs and alcohol before the incident. Anna Marie and May seem to be the most resilient survivors, both writing books about their ordeals. However, they struggle with the notoriety of the West name and fear for their kids being associated with such negative events. The younger siblings that were placed into care were all given new identities. This case is so extensive, there are a lot of books and documentaries about it if you're interested. There is way more information than I could hope to cover in only one video, and much of it wouldn't even be allowed on YouTube. They were some of the most notorious serial killers in the UK, but had you heard of this story before? Would you like to hear more stories from the UK? What do you think motivated and influenced Fred and Rose to commit such horrific acts? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this case and found it interesting. If you did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel for more true crime stories. As always, feel free to share your thoughts and feedback in the comments section below. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you again, and be sure to join us next time as we explore the stories hidden within the wrinkles in crime.